3 days before my son's engagement party, my neighbor grabbed my arm outside the salon on Birch Street and whispered, "Don't react. Come with me, right now." I almost laughed. Mona had been my neighbor for 15 years. I knew her to be steady, sensible, the kind of woman who ran the neighborhood watch and kept a spare key to my house for emergencies. I had never seen her hands shake. They were shaking now. She pulled me through the salon's side door, the one the staff used for deliveries, and led me down a narrow hallway that smelled of perm solution and lavender shampoo. At the end of the hall, she stopped beside a storage closet. Through the thin interior wall, I could hear voices from the styling room next door. 2 voices, one I recognized immediately. My son's fiancé. "The documentation started in February," she was saying, her voice even and professional, nothing like the warm, laughing woman I thought I knew. "I've been keeping notes." Repeated questions, wrong appointment dates. She forgot a client order twice in March. A man's voice answered, measured, practiced. "And the physician. Seeing him next month. He's already been briefed on what to look for." I stopped breathing. "The transfer document is embedded in the gift deed," the man said. "She'll sign it at the party. I'll present it as a formality." Sentimental. A mother officially welcoming her son's future wife into the family business. A pause, the sound of papers shuffling. "Once the cognitive certification is filed," the man continued, "the house and the business transfer automatically. We should have full control by the following week." My neighbor's hand found mine in the dark hallway and held it. I had spent 31 years building fieldstone florals. I started it in the garage of the house, my husband, and I bought the year our son was born. After my husband passed 4 years ago, the shop was what kept me upright. It was where I went at 5 in the morning when I couldn't sleep, where my regular customers knew his name and asked how I was holding up, and where I could say the truth. Some days fine, some days not, but I'm still here. The shop was worth roughly $800,000. The house, another $400,000. The trust my husband set up before he died. Life insurance, his retirement account, sat at just over $1 million. Not a fortune by most people's standards, more than enough to destroy a person's life if it was taken from them. They were talking about me, my son's fiancé, and a man I didn't recognize, 3 days before a party I had cooked for and decorated for and written a toast for, planning to take everything I had left. When the voices stopped and we heard a door close on the far side, Mona turned to look at me. Her face was ashen. "I was getting a trim," she whispered. "I heard her voice through the wall. I called you before I even knew what I was going to say." I nodded. "What are you going to do?" I looked at her. "I need to think." She walked me to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. Through the windshield, the town looked exactly the same as it always had. The old bookstore on the corner, the diner with the hand-painted sign, a woman walking a dog along the sidewalk. Everything ordinary. Everything unchanged. Except everything had changed. My son's fiancé had been documenting incidents since February. It was now June. That was 4 months of building a case against me. 4 months of watching me, recording me, preparing to hand those notes to a doctor who had already been briefed on what to find. I traced it back, last fall. The time I'd asked about the rehearsal dinner menu twice. I had thought I hadn't heard her answer the first time. The appointment date I'd gotten wrong. I had been up until 2 in the morning finishing a funeral order. The client order in March. I had been sick with a sinus infection that week, and my shop assistant had covered for me without complaint. 4 months of ordinary life, carefully reframed as evidence of decline. I started the engine and drove home. In my husband's study, I closed the door and sat in his chair and typed 3 words into the search bar. Power of attorney fraud. The results made my stomach turn. I closed the browser. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. She had handled my husband's estate and she knew me well. When I told her what I had overheard, she didn't speak for a long moment. "Don't sign anything," she said finally. "Not at the party, not before, not after, nothing." There was a man with her. I didn't recognize his voice. "Describe it." I did. She was quiet again. "That sounds like Leighton. If it's who I'm thinking of, this isn't the first time he's been involved in something like this." That single sentence was worse than everything I'd heard through the wall. She gave me a name. A private investigator, retired from the state attorney's office. She said he was thorough and discreet, and that she had used him before. She said if there was a pattern here, he would find it. I wrote the name down, Arthur Vance. I called him that evening. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was quiet and precise, the voice of a man who had heard a great many terrible things and was not going to pretend otherwise. I told him everything, the salon, the voices, the gift deed, the 4 months of documentation. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said, "Do you want the full picture or just enough to stop this?" "The full picture," I said. "Then I need 48 hours. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on top of the covers in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about my son. He was 32 years old, with his father's eyes and his father's laugh, and a stubborn streak a mile wide that had driven me crazy when he was 17, and that I had grown to love in him as a grown man. He had brought her home at Christmas 2 years ago, beaming, certain. I had been genuinely happy for him. When had he started to look at me differently? Last fall, small things. "Mom, you don't have to do everything yourself. Mom, have you thought about stepping back a little? Mom, you seem tired." I had brushed it off. I was tired. I was a widow running a small business, and tired was my baseline. I had not noticed that the comments had started around the same time she came back from visiting her family out west. 48 hours. Arthur arrived at my kitchen table with a folder and a legal pad and a cup of coffee he didn't touch. He set a photograph on the table without preamble. A woman I recognized, younger by 5 years, standing outside a courthouse in another state, next to a man I didn't know. She used her middle name then, Arthur said. She was engaged to the son of a 71-year-old woman in Roanoke. The mother owned a dry cleaning business and a rental property. After a 6-month engagement of attorney at what was described as a family dinner. He paused. Within 3 months, the business was sold. The rental property was transferred to an LLC. The engagement ended shortly after. I stared at the photograph. "She has done this before," I said. "At least once that I can confirm, possibly twice. The second case settled out of court." He set the photograph aside and opened the second folder. Attorney Leighton. 2 bar complaints. 1 dismissed for lack of evidence. 1 resulting in a formal warning, no suspension. Both cases involved power of attorney documents with unusual transfer clauses buried deep in longer paperwork. "He's careful," Arthur said. "The language is technically legal. The fraud is in the misrepresentation, in telling the signer what the document is, rather than what it does." Then the third folder. He placed it on the table slowly. The way you set something down when you know it will land hard. "Your business," he said. "Since January, your son's fiancée has been in contact with a floral wholesale supplier that also works with your main competitor across town. In February, 2 of your corporate event accounts quietly shifted their orders. 1 account told your shop assistant it was a cost decision. It wasn't. She had introduced the decision maker to your competitor at a networking event in December." I closed my eyes. "She has been redirecting your customers," I said. Slowly, carefully, not enough to notice quarter to quarter. "I estimate you have lost roughly $30,000 in revenue since January." He set down his pen. "If the business looks weaker, the transfer is easier to justify. A struggling shop is easier to sell." The kitchen was very quiet. I thought about February, the account that had gone silent. I had blamed the weather. It had been a brutal winter. I had made a note about outreach and then gotten busy with Valentine's season, and the note had sat there untouched. She had counted on exactly that. "What about my son?" I asked. "How much does he know?" Arthur was quiet for a moment. "I believe he's been told you are struggling. I don't believe he knows about the document. I don't believe he knows about Roanoke." That was the thing I kept returning to in the hours that followed. My son had not invented this story. He had been fed it, carefully, over months, by someone who knew which seeds to plant in a man who was afraid of losing his mother. His father had died. He had watched me grieve, watched me push myself, watched me insist I was fine when I wasn't always fine. She had taken that real and tender fear, and she had used it. That didn't make him blameless. But it was not the same thing as what she had done. The morning before the party, my shop assistant Fern called me. She had been with me for 11 years, quiet and steady and deeply perceptive. She said she had something she needed to tell me, and she was sorry she hadn't told me sooner. 2 weeks ago, she said, she had overheard my son's fiancé on the phone in the back room of the shop. She hadn't been able to make out much, but she had heard one sentence clearly. "The old woman won't even see it coming." Fern's voice was barely above a whisper when she said it. I told myself I must have misheard. But I've been thinking about it ever since. "You didn't mishear," I told her. "Thank you." I called my son that afternoon and asked him to come to the house early, alone. He arrived at 4 o'clock looking the way he always looked when he knew something serious was waiting. Careful, a little pale, I sat him at the kitchen table and opened the folder and told him everything. I showed him the photograph from Roanoke first, her face beside the courthouse, the different name on the court document. I watched him look at it. He was very still. Then I showed him the gift deed. I pointed to page 4 and read the transfer clause aloud. I read it slowly so there was no room for misunderstanding. He stared at the page for a long moment. "That's not what she told me it was," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I know." I showed him the revenue documents, the redirected accounts, the wholesale supplier, the networking event in December. He sat with all of it for a long time. Then he looked up. "Mom, I didn't know." "I believe you," I said. "I thought," she said, "Dr. Patterson was concerned about you. That he had mentioned it to her. That we should be proactive before something happened." Dr. Patterson was my family physician. I had seen him 6 weeks ago for a routine physical. He had told me my blood pressure was excellent and asked what I was doing to stay so sharp. "She lied," I said. My son put his hands flat on the table. He looked at everything laid out in front of him, and then he looked at me. "I need to talk to her," he said, "before the guests arrive. Give me a chance to talk to her." I watched him carefully. I knew what that usually meant. A chance for her to explain, to offer another version, to pull him back toward the story she had been building for 8 months. But he was not a child, and I was not going to decide for him. "All right," I said. He was gone for 20 minutes. He came back alone. He didn't tell me what she said. He sat back down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. "She didn't deny it," he said. That was all he said, but I heard everything in it. Guests arrived at 6. I greeted them at the door, poured drinks, laughed at the right moments. My neighbor was there. Fern came. My attorney stood near the bookcase with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking. Arthur had positioned himself near the back hallway without explanation, and no one asked. My son's fiancée arrived 20 minutes late. She walked through the door with a wide smile and came directly to me and said, "Everything looks beautiful." Her voice was warm. Her hands were steady. I wondered how many times she had stood in the middle of a room like this, performing the same easy warmth, waiting for the right moment to place a document on a table. At 7:30, I gave the toast. I had written something beautiful for tonight. Something about watching my son grow, about the way love is a choice you make over and over. I had practiced it in front of the mirror. I set that toast on the mantel and said something else. I talked about what it meant to build something. How my husband and I had started with almost nothing. A garage, 2 buckets, a van that broke down twice a week. How we had built a life from the ground up, year by year, choice by choice. How when he died, I had promised myself I would protect what we made together. Not out of stubbornness, because it was proof that a life spent working honestly and loving well leaves something real behind. The room was quiet. This week, I said, I discovered that someone had been preparing to take that away from me. The quiet changed. It had a different quality now. I opened my laptop, which I had set on the side table earlier in the evening while the guests were arriving. The TV screen behind me lit up. The photograph from Roanoke. Her face, her different name beside the courthouse. Then the gift deed, the relevant clause enlarged, the language plain for anyone to read. I did not look at her while I spoke. I described what I had overheard. The salon, the transfer clause, the 4 months of fabricated documentation. I read the key section of the document aloud slowly, so that everyone in the room understood exactly what had been prepared for me to sign before the evening ended. I talked about Roanoke. The woman there, 71 years old, who had lost her business and her property before she understood what had happened. Who had spent 2 years trying to recover what she could. I talked about the accounts that had quietly moved to my competitor, the wholesale supplier, the networking event in December. And then I said, simply, my son's fiancée has done this before. She came here to do it again, and tonight I am asking her to leave my home. She left without a word. She picked up her bag and walked out, which told me more about her than anything else could. People who have done something wrong usually argue. People who have done this before know when a room has turned against them. The attorney slipped out 2 minutes behind her. My own attorney was at the door. The room was still. Then my neighbor began to cry quietly in the back, and a woman I had known from the garden club for 20 years reached out and took the hand of the woman beside her, and slowly the room came back to itself. My son did not move for a long time. He stood by the fireplace while the last guests said their goodbyes, while Fern quietly packed up the food, while Mona washed the final glasses without being asked. When the house was empty, he sat down across from me. I let her tell me who you were, he said, for 8 months. I know. I stopped listening to you. I started watching for signs. Every time you repeated yourself, every time you seemed tired, I filed it away. He shook his head slowly. I turned into someone who was building a case against his own mother. I wanted to smooth it over the way I had when he was 7 and had broken something and was sitting in the wreckage of it. But he was not 7. And this was not something I could absorb on his behalf. You were afraid, I said. She found that fear and used it. Those are 2 different things. One of them I understand. One of them you'll have to carry. He nodded once and said nothing else. He stayed that night. In the morning I heard him in the kitchen, before I came downstairs, making coffee the way he used to when his father was alive and the 3 of us would sit together before the day started. He set a mug in front of me without a word. We talked about nothing in particular. He left at noon. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that comes after something has been cleaned out. My attorney filed a bar complaint against the attorney. The woman in Roanoke, when word reached her, sent me a letter. It was 3 paragraphs. The last line said, I never got to warn anyone. I'm glad you could. I pinned it on the board in my office. The accounts we had lost began, slowly, to drift back. Not all of them. But in August, Fern called to tell me that one of our oldest corporate clients had just placed the largest single order they had ever given us. She thought I should come in and see it. I drove to the shop and stood in the doorway and looked at the number on the screen and felt, for the first time in a long time, something uncomplicated. My son called every Sunday. The calls were short at first, careful. By September, we were talking for an hour. In October, he told me he had started seeing a counselor. He said he had realized that his fear of losing me had made him into someone who could be used. "I thought loving you meant protecting you," he said one evening. "I didn't know the difference between protecting and diminishing." I didn't answer quickly. That sentence deserved more than a quick answer. In November, he asked if he could come for Thanksgiving. I said yes. He arrived the Wednesday before, the way he used to do when his father was alive, driving up the night before so the two of them could argue about the turkey. He came alone this time, with groceries and a bottle of wine. We cooked together for 3 hours. We argued about the turkey. It made us both laugh in a way that felt careful at first, and then didn't. At the table before we ate, he lifted his glass. "To you," he said, "for not letting them win." I looked at my son sitting at his father's table, still figuring out who he was, still mine. "To us," I said. We ate. The house was warm. Through the window, the oak tree in the backyard, the one my husband had planted the year we moved in, had lost its last leaves, its bare branches reaching up against the November sky, patient the way trees are patient, waiting for what comes next. It was not the same as before, but it was something real, something we were building again, slowly and honestly, the only way things that last are ever built at all.